1. The Vanishing Path. The Appalachian Trail, renowned for its breathtaking vistas and diverse wildlife, has also earned a reputation for its more sinister tales. Seasoned hikers share stories around campfires, whispering about the eerie experiences that have befallen some who dare to tread its ancient paths. Among these stories, none is more chilling than the tale of the Vanishing Path. It was a foggy autumn morning when Sarah and her friends set out on their long-anticipated hiking trip. The group had been planning this adventure for months, eager to escape their daily routines and immerse themselves in nature's tranquility. Little did they know, they were about to stumble upon a forgotten chapter of the trail's dark history. The hike began smoothly. The crisp air invigorated them, and the vibrant fall colors painted a picturesque landscape. As they ascended the trail, laughter and conversation flowed freely. Hours passed, and the group reached a dense section of forest where the canopy overhead blocked out much of the daylight, casting an ominous shadow. "Let's take a break," Sarah suggested, pointing to a small clearing just off the main path. They settled down, munching on snacks and sharing stories. Amid the light-hearted chatter, an old, tattered sign caught Sarah's eye. Partially obscured by overgrown vines, it read, "Beware the Vanishing Path." "Hey, look at this," she called out, curiosity peeking in her voice. Her friends gathered around, intrigued. Probably just an old legend. Mark, the most skeptical of the group, dismissed it with a wave of his hand. You know how these trails are full of ghost stories. But Sarah felt a shiver run down her spine. Something about the sign felt wrong. Chapter 2. The Descent into Darkness. Ignoring their unease, the group decided to press on. They followed the trail deeper into the forest, where the trees grew thicker and the light dimmer. As the path narrowed, an eerie silence enveloped them, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves. Suddenly, they came upon a fork in the trail. One path was well-trodden, while the other, barely visible, was overgrown and seemed rarely used. A small, weathered marker pointed to the overgrown path with faint, barely legible letters, "Vanishing Path." "Should we check it out?" Sarah asked, her curiosity warring with a growing sense of dread. "Why not?" Mark said, leading the way. "It's probably just an old shortcut." Reluctantly, the others followed. The Vanishing Path was narrow and twisted, forcing them to walk single file. The deeper they went, the thicker the fog became, swirling around them like ghostly tendrils. The forest grew eerily quiet, the usual sounds of wildlife conspicuously absent. After what felt like an eternity, they reached a clearing. At the center stood an ancient, gnarled tree, its branches stretching out like skeletal arms. Strange symbols were carved into its bark, and at its base lay a weathered journal. Sarah picked up the journal, its pages yellowed and brittle. She opened it carefully, revealing scrawled entries detailing the experiences of past hikers. The final entry, dated over 50 years ago, sent a chill down her spine. "We are lost. The path has vanished, and the forest is closing in. If anyone finds this, beware the Vanishing Path." Chapter 3. the haunting. Panic began to set in as the group realized they were lost. The trail they had followed seemed to dissolve into the forest, leaving no trace of their route. Desperation drove them to search for any sign of the path, but the fog obscured their vision, and the forest seemed to shift around them. Hours passed, and the once friendly woods now felt like a labyrinth of nightmares. Shadows danced in the corner of their eyes, and whispering voices seemed to echo from the trees. Every rustle of leaves sent their hearts racing. "We need to stick together," Sarah urged, her voice trembling. "We can't afford to get separated." But the forest had other plans. As night fell, the fog thickened, and the group found themselves struggling to stay together. The eerie whispers grew louder, more insistent, as if the forest itself was alive and mocking them. Mark, who had been leading the group, suddenly froze. "Did you hear that?" he whispered, eyes wide with fear. They all listened intently. At first, there was nothing but the oppressive silence. Then, faintly, they heard it, a soft, almost melodic humming, like a lullaby carried on the wind. "It's coming from over there," Sarah pointed towards the darkest part of the forest. Despite their fear, they followed the sound, hoping it would lead them to safety. Instead, it led them deeper into the heart of the woods, where the trees grew so dense that even the fog struggled to penetrate. In the gloom, they stumbled upon a dilapidated cabin, barely visible through the thick underbrush. The humming grew louder, emanating from within. Summoning their courage, they approached the door. Chapter 4: The Cabin. The door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit interior. The source of the humming was now clear, an old gramophone spinning an ancient, scratched record. The haunting melody filled the cabin, echoing off the walls. As they stepped inside, the temperature dropped sharply. Their breath misted in the cold air, and a sense of foreboding washed over them. The cabin was filled with old, rotting furniture and cobwebs that seemed to glisten in the weak light. Sarah noticed a photograph on the mantelpiece. It showed a group of hikers, similar to their own, standing in front of the same cabin. The date on the photo was from decades ago, and the faces in the picture were marked with the same terror that Sarah felt now. "We need to get out of here," she whispered, but as she turned to leave, the door slammed shut with a force that rattled the cabin. Panic set in. They pounded on the door, but it wouldn't budge. The humming grew louder, more distorted, as if the gramophone were mocking their plight. Suddenly, the air grew thick with whispers, unintelligible and maddening. The walls seemed to close in, and shadows danced in the corners of their vision. The cabin itself felt alive, pulsating with a malevolent energy. "There's no way out," Mark's voice broke, his fear palpable. "No, there has to be," Sarah insisted, fighting to stay calm. "Look for anything, a window, a trapdoor." As they frantically searched, Sarah found a trapdoor hidden beneath a tattered rug. They pried it open, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. With no other option, they climbed down, the air growing colder and more oppressive with each step. The stairs creaked under their weight, and the whispers grew louder, more frenzied. Chapter 5: the final descent. The staircase led to a small, dank basement. The air was thick with mold and decay, and the only light came from a single, flickering bulb. In the center of the room stood an old, wooden table covered in dust and cobwebs. On it lay a map showing a maze of tunnels beneath the forest. "This must be a way out," Sarah said, grabbing the map. But as she did, the whispers intensified, and a cold wind swept through the basement, extinguishing the light. In total darkness, they fumbled to find their way. The map was their only guide, but the tunnels twisted and turned, each passage looking identical to the last. The air grew colder, and the whispers seemed to come from all directions, disorienting them. "We're going in circles," Mark said, panic rising in his voice. "No, we just have to keep moving," Sarah insisted, though her own fear was mounting. As they pressed on, the tunnels seemed to close in, the walls narrowing until they were forced to crawl. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and the sense of being watched became unbearable. Finally, they saw a faint light ahead. Summoning their last reserves of strength, they crawled towards it, emerging into another clearing, similar to the one they had left. But something was different. The ancient tree still stood, its symbols glowing faintly in the dark. The fog had lifted slightly, revealing a path leading out of the clearing. With renewed hope, they followed the path, their pace quickening as the oppressive atmosphere began to lift. The whispers faded, and the forest began to feel like a forest again. They stumbled out of the woods, exhausted and shaken, but alive. The sun was rising, casting a warm glow over the landscape. They collapsed on the ground, overwhelmed with relief. Epilogue: The Return. Weeks later, Sarah sat at her desk, trying to process their harrowing experience. She had spent countless hours researching the vanishing path and the strange occurrences in the forest. Her search led her to old newspaper articles and forgotten records, all hinting at a dark history of the trail. The most chilling discovery was an old diary entry, dated nearly a century ago, describing an encounter eerily similar to their own. The author had barely escaped with their life, warning future hikers of the path's dangers. Sarah knew she had to share their story, to warn others of the horrors they had faced. As she typed the final words of their tale, she felt a strange sense of closure. The forest had let them go, but its secrets remained. And so, the legend of the vanishing path grew, passed down from one generation of hikers to the next, a cautionary tale of the dangers lurking in the heart of nature. The Appalachian Trail, with all its beauty, held a darkness that few dared to explore. But for those who did, the forest never forgot.
It was faint at first, but grew louder and more desperate. I stood up, trying to pinpoint the direction of the sound. It seemed to be coming from deeper in the woods. My first instinct was to help. Maybe someone was hurt or lost. I grabbed my flashlight and headed towards the sound, calling out, "Hello? Do you need help?" The crying stopped abruptly. I shone my flashlight around but saw nothing. The silence was deafening. Unease settled over me as I made my way back to my camp. Just as I reached the edge of the clearing, the crying started again, this time closer. Panic set in. I hurried back to my tent, zipped it up, and sat in the darkness, listening. The crying continued, circling my campsite. It sounded like it was moving, but there were no footsteps, no rustling leaves, just the eerie, disembodied sobbing. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I fell into a restless sleep. I woke up at dawn, the forest back to its normal, peaceful state. I packed up and left as quickly as possible, constantly looking over my shoulder. I later learned that there had been several reports of a ghostly woman crying in those woods, a legend passed down through generations. Some say she was a young bride who drowned in the lake, her spirit forever wandering, searching for help that never comes. Story 3: The Shadow Man. A few years ago, I decided to camp alone in a remote part of the Pacific Northwest. The dense forests and rugged terrain promised a perfect escape from civilization. I chose a spot near a river, with towering trees providing a canopy overhead. The first day was uneventful. I hiked, took photographs, and enjoyed the serenity. As night fell, I built a fire and cooked my dinner. The forest was alive with nocturnal sounds, owls hooting, branches swaying in the breeze. I felt at peace. Around midnight, I noticed something strange. Across the river, just beyond the firelight's reach, I saw a shadow. It was tall and humanoid, standing perfectly still. I blinked, thinking it was a trick of the light, but it remained. I called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" No response. The shadow didn't move. Unnerved, I added more wood to the fire, hoping the increased light would reveal what was casting the shadow. It didn't. For hours, I sat there, staring at the figure. It never moved, never made a sound. Eventually, fatigue took over, and I retreated to my tent, but sleep was elusive. Every time I opened my eyes, I expected to see the shadow looming over me. The next morning, I crossed the river to investigate. There was nothing, no footprints, no signs of anyone having been there. I shrugged it off as my imagination and decided to stay another night. That evening, as I sat by the fire, the shadow returned. Have you ever been alone on a stormy night, the house creaking and groaning under the weight of the wind, rain lashing against the windows, and an eerie sense of unease creeping up your spine? If you have, then you'll understand the terror of being home alone during a storm. Let me tell you about a night I will never forget, a night that still haunts me whenever I hear the rumble of distant thunder. It was a late October evening, and the weather forecast had predicted heavy rain and thunderstorms throughout the night. My parents had to attend an out-of-town event and would not be back until the following afternoon. They left me in charge, confident that at 17, I was responsible enough to handle myself. I assured them I'd be fine and even looked forward to having the house to myself for the night. The storm began just after sunset. The sky, already dark from the autumn evening, turned an ominous shade of gray. As the first drops of rain hit the roof, I felt a shiver run down my spine. I shook off the feeling, attributing it to the sudden chill in the air, and made my way to the living room. I planned to binge watch some of my favorite horror movies. Ironic, I know, considering what was about to unfold. I was halfway through my second movie when the storm intensified. The wind howled like a chorus of lost souls, and the rain drummed against the windows with relentless fury. Thunder boomed so loudly it felt like the house was shaking. I turned up the volume to drown out the noise, immersing myself in the on-screen terror to distract from the storm outside. Around 11, the power went out. The TV flickered off, plunging the house into darkness. I cursed under my breath, fumbling for my phone to use its flashlight. I made my way to the kitchen to find some candles. The eerie silence of the house, interrupted only by the sound of rain and thunder, was unnerving. I lit a few candles and placed them around the living room, their flickering light casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. I tried to get comfortable, scrolling through my phone to check the weather updates. There was nothing new, just more warnings about the severity of the storm. I decided to text my parents to let them know the power was out, but there was no signal. Typical, I thought, just when I needed it the most. As I sat there, the house began to feel different. The usual creaks and groans seemed louder, more pronounced. The shadows cast by the candlelight seemed to move in unnatural ways. I told myself it was just my imagination, fueled by the horror movies and the storm outside. Yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Suddenly, there was a loud bang from upstairs. My heart jumped into my throat. I froze, listening intently. Another bang, followed by what sounded like footsteps. My rational mind tried to come up with explanations. Maybe a window had blown open, or something had fallen. But deep down, I knew those were footsteps. I stood up slowly, the floorboards creaking under my weight. The footsteps continued, slow and deliberate, as if someone was walking down the hallway above me. I grabbed the heaviest thing within reach, a metal candlestick, and made my way to the staircase. Each step I took was tentative, my heart pounding in my ears, my breath shallow. At the top of the stairs, I paused, straining to hear. The footsteps had stopped. I waited, every second stretching into an eternity. Then, there it was again, a soft thud, coming from my parents' bedroom. I tightened my grip on the candlestick and walked down the hall. The door to their room was ajar, a thin sliver of darkness peeking through. I pushed the door open with trembling hands. The room was empty, but the window was wide open, rain pouring in and pooling on the floor. I hurried to close it, my mind racing. Had someone been in here? Were they still in the house? I checked the closet and under the bed, but found nothing. Still, the feeling of being watched persisted. I decided to check the rest of the house, starting with the other bedrooms. Each room was empty, the windows securely shut. The only place left was the attic. I stood at the base of the attic stairs, staring up into the darkness. The thought of going up there filled me with dread, but I had to be sure. I climbed the narrow steps, the air growing colder with each step. At the top, I pulled the cord to turn on the light. The bulb flickered weakly before casting a dim glow over the attic's contents. Boxes and old furniture were piled haphazardly, casting strange shadows in the corners. I walked through the attic, checking behind every box and under every sheet, but found nothing. Relieved but still on edge, I descended the stairs and returned to the living room. I sat on the couch, trying to calm my racing heart. I told myself it was just the storm playing tricks on me. Maybe the wind had blown the window open, and the noises were just the house settling. I tried to convince myself of this, but the unease lingered. Then I heard it again, a soft creak, coming from the kitchen. I turned slowly, the candlelight flickering ominously. I saw a shadow move across the doorway. My blood ran cold. I wasn't alone. Someone was in the house with me. I held my breath, listening. The shadow moved again, followed by the sound of something being dragged across the floor. I had to make a decision: stay and confront whatever was in the kitchen, or try to escape. I chose the latter, knowing that getting out of the house was my best chance. I crept towards the front door, moving as quietly as possible. Just as I reached for the doorknob, it turned from the outside. The door swung open and I screamed, raising the candlestick to defend myself. But it wasn't an intruder, it was my neighbor, Mr. Henderson. He looked as startled as I was. "I heard a noise and saw your lights were out," he explained. "I wanted to make sure you were okay." Relief flooded through me. I lowered the candlestick, feeling foolish for my overreaction. I explained about the noises and the open window, and he offered to check the house with me. We went through each room again, but found nothing. He even checked the attic, but there was no sign of anyone. Satisfied that I was safe, Mr. Henderson left, promising to keep an eye on the house until my parents returned. I locked the door behind him and went back to the living room, exhausted and still a little shaken. I decided to try and get some sleep, hoping the morning light would chase away the remnants of fear. As I lay on the couch, listening to the rain and the distant rumble of thunder, I finally started to relax. The house was quiet, the storm beginning to subside. I closed my eyes, drifting off to sleep. I don't know how long I slept, but I woke to a sound that made my blood run cold. It was a whisper, so close it felt like it was right next to my ear. I sat up, heart pounding, and looked around. The candles had burned out, and the room was pitch black. Then I heard it again, a whisper, coming from the direction of the kitchen. I grabbed my phone, using its light to guide me as I crept towards the sound. My hand shook so badly I could barely hold the phone steady. The whispering continued, soft and unintelligible, sending chills down my spine. I reached the kitchen and shone the light around. At first, I saw nothing. Then, in the corner of the room, I saw a figure. It was small, hunched over, and its features were obscured by the darkness. I froze, unable to move or even scream. The figure slowly turned towards me, and I saw its face. It was pale and gaunt, eyes sunken deep into its skull. It opened its mouth, and the whispering grew louder, filling my head with a cacophony of voices. I stumbled back, dropping my phone, the light going out as it hit the floor. I ran from the kitchen, blindly fumbling my way through the dark house. I could hear the whispering following me, growing louder and more frantic. I made it to the front door and flung it open, sprinting out into the rain. I didn't stop running until I reached Mr. Henderson's house, pounding on his door and begging for help. Mr. Henderson let me in, and I told him everything. He called the police, who searched my house thoroughly. They found no evidence of an intruder or any sign of the figure I had seen. They chalked it up to my imagination, a combination of the storm and the dark playing tricks on my mind. But I knew what I had seen and heard. I stayed with Mr. Henderson until my parents returned the next day. They were concerned but reassured me that it was just a bad dream. Maybe it was, but to this day, I can't shake the feeling that something was in that house with me, something not of this world. Now, every time a storm rolls in, I remember that night. I remember the fear, the whispering, and the figure in the kitchen. And I wonder if, one day, it will come back for me. So, if you ever find yourself alone on a stormy night, be careful. You never know what might be lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. Story 1. The Hitchhiker. Driving at night always had a certain allure for me. The hum of the engine, the patter of rain on the windshield, and the occasional flash of headlights from oncoming cars. It was a perfect escape from the hustle and bustle of the day. One particular night, however, turned my love for late-night drives into a haunting memory I can't shake off. I was heading back from a friend's house. The rain had started to pour heavily, and the roads were nearly deserted. I enjoyed the solitude, the rhythmic swish of the wipers, and the way the world outside my car seemed to blur into an impressionistic painting. But then I saw him, standing by the side of the road, drenched and shivering, was a man in a raincoat. He was hitchhiking. Normally, I wouldn't stop for strangers, especially not in such a desolate area, but something about his desperate, pleading eyes made me slow down. I rationalized it. Maybe he was stranded. Maybe he just needed help. I pulled over, and he jogged up to the passenger side. I rolled down the window just a crack. "Need a ride?" I asked. "Yes, please," he replied, his voice shaky. "My car broke down a few miles back. I just need to get to the nearest town." Despite a lingering sense of unease, I unlocked the door. He climbed in, dripping water onto the seat. As we drove, we made small talk. His name was Tom, and he was headed to visit his family. He seemed harmless enough, but there was something off about him that I couldn't quite place. The rain intensified, and visibility grew worse. I focused on the road, the rhythmic thud of the wipers the only sound between us. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw him staring at me, his expression unreadable. "You live around here?" he asked suddenly, breaking the silence. "Not too far," I replied, keeping my eyes on the road. "Just passing through." "Must be nice," he murmured, almost to himself, "to have somewhere to go." Before I could respond, the car lurched. I had hit something, a pothole, maybe. The car skidded, and I fought to regain control. We came to a stop on the side of the road. My heart was pounding. "Stay here," I told Tom. "I'll check it out." I stepped out into the rain, which was coming down harder than ever. I inspected the tires. All seemed fine. But as I rounded the car, I noticed something strange. There were muddy footprints leading away from the road into the woods. They looked fresh. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the rain. I hurried back to the car, but when I opened the door, Tom was gone. I called out, but there was no response. Panic set in. I checked my phone, no signal. I was alone, in the middle of nowhere, with no idea what had just happened. As I stood there, drenched and bewildered, I heard a rustling in the woods. I spun around, heart racing. A figure emerged, not Tom, but someone else, someone gaunt and pale, with hollow eyes that seemed to pierce through me. "You shouldn't have stopped," he whispered. "He's not what you think." I stumbled back, tripping over my own feet. When I looked up again, the figure was gone. I scrambled into the car, locked the doors, and drove off as fast as I could. I didn't stop until I reached the next town, where I collapsed in a diner, shaking and soaked to the bone. To this day, I don't know who or what I encountered that night. I never saw Tom again, and part of me wonders if he was ever real. But every time it rains, I feel a cold dread creeping over me, and I can't help but look over my shoulder, fearing that one day I'll see those hollow eyes staring back at me. Story 2. The Abandoned Gas Station. It was a dark and stormy night. Cliché, I know, but that's exactly how it was. I was driving back home after visiting some friends out of town. The rain was relentless, and my windshield wipers were working overtime. I had taken a wrong turn somewhere and found myself on a deserted country road. My gas tank was nearly empty, and I was starting to panic. Then, as if by some miracle, I saw a flickering neon sign up ahead. Gas. I sighed in relief and pulled into the station. It looked old, abandoned even, but the lights were on. I got out of the car, shivering as the rain soaked through my jacket. The place was eerily quiet, the only sound the rain pounding on the roof. I walked to the pump and lifted the nozzle, but nothing happened. No gas. Frustrated, I decided to check inside. Maybe there was someone who could help. The door creaked as I pushed it open. Inside, the air was musty, and the place looked like it hadn't been touched in years. Dust-covered shelves, empty coolers, and a counter with an old cash register. No one was there. I was about to leave when I heard a noise from the back room, a faint shuffling sound. "Hello." I called out. "Is anyone here?" No response. I walked towards the noise, my heart pounding in my chest. I reached the back room and slowly opened the door. The room was dark, but I could make out the shape of a figure hunched over in the corner. "Excuse me," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I need some gas. Can you help me?" The figure didn't move. I took a step closer, and that's when I smelled it, the stench of decay. My stomach turned, and I realized with horror that the figure wasn't alive. It was a corpse, dressed in a gas station attendant's uniform, decomposed and rotting. I stumbled back, gagging, and turned to run. But as I did, I saw something else, a message scrawled on the wall in what looked like blood. "Don't leave." I didn't need to be told twice. I bolted out of the room, through the store, and back to my car. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking, and finally got the engine started. As I sped away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. Standing in the doorway of the gas station was another figure, watching me. It was hard to make out in the rain, but it looked just like the corpse I had seen inside. Except this one was standing, and its eyes seemed to glow in the darkness. I didn't stop driving until I reached a town several miles away. I found another gas station, filled up, and didn't say a word about what I'd seen. Who would believe me? Even now, whenever I drive by a gas station at night, I can't help but feel a shiver down my spine, remembering those glowing eyes and the message on the wall. Some places, I've learned, are best left alone. Story 3. The Phantom Car. There's something about driving in the rain that always calmed me. The sound of raindrops against the roof, the cool air, and the dim, muted lights of the world outside. But one night, a drive in the rain turned into a nightmare that haunts me to this day. I was on my way back from a late shift at work. The road was a winding one through the forest, with tall trees on either side creating a tunnel effect. The rain was heavy, and the visibility was poor. I was driving cautiously, my headlights barely penetrating the darkness ahead. Suddenly, in my rearview mirror, I saw headlights. A car was coming up fast behind me. It seemed strange, given the weather and the condition of the road. I slowed down to let it pass, but it didn't. Instead, it stayed right on my tail, its bright lights blinding me. Annoyed, I sped up, hoping to put some distance between us. But the car matched my speed. I glanced back, trying to see the driver, but the rain and the glare made it impossible. My frustration turned to fear. Who would drive like this in such conditions? I decided to pull over and let the car pass. I slowed down and moved to the side of the road. But instead of passing, the car stopped right behind me. I felt a chill run down my spine. This wasn't normal. I waited, hoping the driver would get out, maybe explain what they were doing. But no one did. The car just sat there, idling, its headlights casting an eerie glow through the rain. After a few tense minutes, I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to confront the driver. I grabbed a flashlight from my glove compartment, took a deep breath, and stepped out into the rain. I approached the car cautiously, shining my light into the windshield. What I saw made my blood run cold. The car was empty. The engine was running. The lights were on, but there was no one inside. I stumbled back, heart pounding, and rushed back to my car. As soon as I got inside and locked the doors, the other car's headlights went out. I fumbled with my keys, trying to start the engine, but my hands were shaking too much. Finally, the car roared to life, and I sped off, not daring to look back. The rain seemed to pour even harder, the trees blurring past as I drove as fast as I could. I didn't stop until I reached home, where I parked in my driveway, ran inside, and locked all the doors. I didn't sleep that night. The image of that empty car, idling in the rain, haunted me. I never found out whose car it was, or why it was following me. But every time I drive that road, I feel a sense of dread, fearing I might see those headlights in my rearview mirror again. Some say it was just a trick of the rain, a hallucination brought on by exhaustion and the storm. But I know what I saw, and I know that out there, on that lonely forest road, something unexplainable happened. Something that turned a peaceful rainy night into a waking nightmare. These 3 stories capture the eerie and unsettling atmosphere of driving alone on a rainy night, blending the ordinary with the supernatural in a way that leaves a lasting impression. Hiking can be a deeply fulfilling activity, offering a connection with nature, a sense of adventure, and often a peaceful retreat from the hustle and bustle of daily life. However, sometimes these tranquil paths can lead to encounters that are anything but serene. Here are 5 true, spine-chilling tales from hikers who have experienced the terror lurking in the wilderness. 1. The Whispering Woods of Pennsylvania. The Appalachian Trail is famous for its breathtaking scenery and challenging routes. However, a particular section in Pennsylvania is notorious for the unnerving experiences of those who traverse it. Known among locals as the Whispering Woods, this part of the trail has a dark reputation. The tale of Sarah and Mark. Sarah and Mark, experienced hikers from New York, decided to tackle this section during their summer vacation. They set up camp near a picturesque clearing, planning to rest before continuing their hike. As night fell, an eerie stillness settled over the woods. The usual sounds of wildlife were absent, replaced by an unsettling silence. Around midnight, Sarah was awakened by the faint sound of whispering. She initially thought it was the wind, but the whispers grew louder and seemed to be circling their tent. She nudged Mark awake, and they both listened in fear as the whispers turned into clear voices, speaking in an unknown language. Terrified, they huddled together, trying to ignore the voices. When morning finally came, they packed up hastily and left, later learning that other hikers had reported similar experiences in the Whispering Woods. Some locals believe it's the spirits of long-lost travelers who never made it out. 2. The Phantom of Mount Katahdin. Mount Katahdin in Maine is a popular destination for adventurous hikers, but it's also home to one of the most haunting tales in hiking folklore: the disappearance of Jim Bradley. In the fall of 2002, Jim Bradley, an avid hiker and outdoor enthusiast, set out to conquer Mount Katahdin alone. He was well prepared and experienced, but he never returned. A massive search effort was launched, but no trace of Jim was ever found. Several years later, in 2010, a group of hikers reported seeing a lone figure at the summit. The figure waved at them before vanishing into thin air. The hikers, puzzled and frightened, described the figure as matching Jim's description down to the same red jacket he was wearing when he disappeared. Despite extensive searches, Jim's body was never found, and his ghostly appearance remains a mystery. 3. The haunted cave of the Pacific Crest Trail. Stretching from the Mexican border to Canada, the Pacific Crest Trail offers some of the most diverse and beautiful landscapes in the United States. Yet, amidst its beauty, there are dark places that have left hikers with chilling stories. The encounter of Laura Simmons. Laura Simmons, a solo hiker, was traversing a remote section of the trail in Oregon when she decided to take shelter in a cave for the night. She was aware of the local legend about the haunted cave, but dismissed it as mere superstition. That night, Laura was awakened by a cold breeze and the feeling of being watched. As she peered into the darkness, she saw the faint outline of a man standing at the cave's entrance. He was motionless, and his eyes seemed to glow in the dark. Paralyzed with fear, Laura closed her eyes, hoping it was a dream. When she opened them again, the figure was gone. The next morning, she left the cave at first light, still shaken by the experience. Other hikers have since reported similar sightings, leading to the belief that the cave is haunted by the spirit of a miner who died there in the 1800s. 4. The Beast of Big Sur. Big Sur, California, is known for its stunning coastline and rugged trails. It's also known for something much more sinister: the sightings of the shadow creature. Several hikers have reported seeing a large, shadowy figure lurking in the forests of Big Sur. Descriptions of the creature vary, but most agree that it is tall, humanoid, and moves with an unnatural speed and silence. One notable encounter was reported by a group of friends camping near the Bixby Creek Bridge. They were gathered around a campfire when they heard rustling in the bushes. Assuming it was a deer, they ignored it until one of them caught a glimpse of a tall, dark figure darting between the trees. The figure seemed to be watching them. Frightened, the group decided to pack up and leave. As they were driving away, one of them looked back and saw the creature standing on the roadside, illuminated by their car's taillights, before it vanished into the woods. The incident has become a local legend, with many speculating about the true nature of the beast. 5. The Silent Watcher of the Scottish Highlands. The Scottish Highlands are a hiker's paradise, with vast landscapes and ancient history. However, some trails are said to be watched by an ominous presence. The experience of Daniel MacLeod. Daniel MacLeod, a seasoned hiker, was exploring a remote part of the Highlands when he felt an overwhelming sense of dread. He described the feeling as if someone was watching his every move. Determined to continue, he pressed on but couldn't shake the feeling. As night fell, Daniel set up camp, but sleep eluded him. The sense of being watched grew stronger, and he started hearing soft footsteps around his tent. Gathering his courage, he unzipped the tent and shone his flashlight into the darkness. There was nothing there, but the feeling persisted. The next morning, Daniel found strange footprints around his campsite. They were unlike any animal tracks he had ever seen, resembling large human footprints, but with an eerie, elongated shape. He left the highlands immediately, convinced that something unnatural was watching him. These spine-chilling tales serve as a reminder that even in the most serene and beautiful places, the wilderness can hold dark and terrifying secrets. Hikers who dare to venture into these haunted trails do so at their own risk, knowing that they might encounter something far beyond the realm of the ordinary. Five true creepy tales of night camping. Camping is often seen as a tranquil escape from the bustle of daily life, a chance to reconnect with nature and find peace under the stars. However, sometimes the wilderness holds more than just the serenity we seek. Here are 5 true stories that reveal the eerie and unsettling side of night camping. 1. The whistling in the woods. Appalachian Trail, Eastern United States. Sarah and her friend Mark were seasoned hikers and had taken on numerous trails, but the Appalachian Trail was a new challenge. They planned a week-long hike, camping along the way. On their 3rd night, they set up camp in a dense part of the forest, miles away from the nearest town. As darkness fell, the sounds of the forest seemed to amplify. The usual chirps and rustles were comforting until they heard a distinct, haunting whistle. It was a slow, deliberate tune that neither of them recognized. Assuming it was another hiker, they initially paid it no mind. However, the whistling persisted, growing closer and more insistent. When they tried to call out, there was no response. Mark suggested it might be someone in distress, so they ventured a short distance from their camp, flashlights in hand. The whistling stopped abruptly, leaving an eerie silence. Returning to their campsite, they found their gear undisturbed, but felt a sense of unease. The whistling resumed just as they tried to settle in for the night, circling their camp. They stayed awake, too afraid to sleep, until the first light of dawn allowed them to hurriedly pack up and leave. They never saw anyone, and the source of the whistling remains a mystery. 2. The Phantom Campfire. Yosemite National Park, California. Jake and Lisa were avid campers who decided to spend a weekend in Yosemite National Park. They found a secluded spot by a serene lake and set up their tent. After a day of hiking, they sat by their campfire, enjoying the quiet night. As the evening progressed, they noticed a faint glow through the trees, suggesting another campfire not far from their location. Curious, Jake decided to take a closer look. He walked towards the light, expecting to find fellow campers. Instead, he found an abandoned campsite with a smoldering fire, but no signs of people or recent activity. Feeling a bit unnerved, he returned to Lisa, and they decided to keep to themselves. However, throughout the night, they heard laughter and murmured conversations carried on the wind, seemingly coming from the direction of the phantom campfire. The next morning, Jake revisited the spot in daylight. There was no trace of a campsite, no fire pit, no ashes. It was as if the previous night's scene had never existed. They left Yosemite with more questions than answers, haunted by the eerie experience. 3. The Watcher in the Shadows. Black Hills National Forest, South Dakota. During a late summer, 3 friends, Mike, Jenna, and Alex, embarked on a camping trip to the Black Hills National Forest. They found a remote spot, far from the main trails, to truly immerse themselves in nature. Their first night was uneventful, but on the second night, things took a turn for the worse. As they sat around the campfire, they had the distinct feeling of being watched. Jenna dismissed it as paranoia, but Mike and Alex couldn't shake the sensation. Later that night, while they were inside their tents, the feeling intensified. They heard twigs snapping and leaves rustling nearby. Mike peeked out and saw a figure standing just beyond the firelight, barely visible in the shadows. He quickly woke the others, but by the time they looked, the figure was gone. Deciding it was best to stay together, they moved into a single tent. Throughout the night, they heard soft footsteps circling their campsite. Every time they mustered the courage to check, there was nothing there. The next morning, they found footprints around their camp, but no indication of who or what had been watching them. They cut their trip short and left the forest with a lingering sense of dread. 4. The Crying Baby. Ouachita National Forest, Arkansas. Karen and her husband Tom chose the Ouachita National Forest for a quiet camping getaway. They set up camp by a clear stream and spent the day exploring. As night fell, they enjoyed a peaceful dinner by the campfire. Around midnight, they were jolted awake by the sound of a baby crying. Confused and concerned, they listened intently. The cries seemed to come from the dense woods nearby. Karen wanted to investigate, fearing a lost child, but Tom felt uneasy and suggested they stay put until morning. The crying continued intermittently throughout the night, stopping and starting without any apparent reason. When daylight broke, they searched the area but found no signs of a baby or anyone else. They reported the incident to a park ranger who revealed that they weren't the first to hear the phantom cries. According to local lore, the cries were attributed to a tragic accident that occurred decades ago, involving a lost child whose spirit still roamed the forest. 5. The Skinwalker Encounter. Grand Canyon National Park, Arizona. A group of friends, Eric, Zoe, Liam, and Hannah, decided to spend a few nights camping near the Grand Canyon. They chose a less traveled area to avoid the usual tourist crowds. Their first day was filled with breathtaking views and adventure, but the nights were a different story. On the second night, they were gathered around the fire when they heard rustling in the bushes. Assuming it was an animal, they didn't pay much attention until the sound grew louder and more erratic. Eric shone his flashlight towards the noise and caught a glimpse of what he described as a large, humanoid figure moving swiftly among the trees. The figure's movements were unnaturally fluid, almost like it was gliding. Zoe, who was familiar with Native American legends, whispered that it could be a skinwalker, a shapeshifter from Navajo lore. Skeptical but unsettled, they tried to ignore it and went to bed. Throughout the night, they heard unsettling noises, whispers, footsteps, and the occasional guttural growl. The next morning, they found strange tracks around their campsite, not quite human, not quite animal. They packed up and left, their excitement for the Grand Canyon overshadowed by a sense of lingering fear and the unsettling feeling that they had encountered something beyond the natural world. These stories serve as a reminder that while nature offers peace and beauty, it also holds mysteries and dangers that can turn a simple camping trip into an unforgettable and chilling experience. Whether it's the unexplained sounds, mysterious figures, or eerie encounters, these tales highlight the thin veil between the natural and supernatural, and the lingering question of what truly lies in the heart of the wilderness. They called it the sleep experiment. It was supposed to be a breakthrough in understanding human endurance, something that would push the boundaries of science. But no one anticipated the horrors it would unleash. I was one of the researchers involved, and I still can't believe what we did. The year was 1952. The Cold War was raging, and governments around the world were desperate to find new ways to gain the upper hand. Our team was recruited by the military to conduct an experiment on sleep deprivation. They wanted to see how long humans could go without sleep before their minds and bodies broke down. The results, they hoped, would lead to new interrogation techniques, or ways to keep soldiers awake and alert for extended periods. We were given a group of 5 political prisoners who had been condemned to death. In exchange for participating in the experiment, their sentences would be commuted to life imprisonment. It was a deal with the devil, but they accepted, probably hoping they could survive whatever we had planned. We set up a sealed environment for them, a room equipped with microphones and cameras, so we could monitor their every move. The room was stocked with food and water, and we introduced a gas that would keep them awake. We thought it was safe. How wrong we were. The first few days were uneventful. The prisoners were calm, engaging in conversations, playing cards, and eating regularly. They showed signs of fatigue, but the gas kept them from sleeping. By the 5th day, the mood began to change. They started to exhibit irritability and paranoia, accusing each other of stealing food and plotting to escape. The conversations grew darker, more hostile. By the 9th day, their behavior had become erratic. They stopped talking to each other and began whispering to the microphones, as if confiding in us, their unseen observers. They talked about their fears, their regrets, and their dreams. It was as if they were unraveling, piece by piece. On the 11th day, things took a horrifying turn. One of the prisoners began screaming uncontrollably. His voice was raw, the sound of pure terror. The others didn't react. They just stared blankly, as if the scream was coming from another dimension. The man screamed for hours until his vocal cords gave out, leaving him with nothing but a hoarse rasp. Then, silence. A deafening, oppressive silence. It was worse than the screams. We watched in horror as the prisoners began to mutilate themselves. One man tore the flesh from his own arms with his teeth. Another gouged out his eyes. Blood pooled on the floor, and yet they remained awake, driven by some primal, nightmarish force. We wanted to intervene, to stop the experiment, but the military insisted we continue. They needed to see the results, no matter the cost. So, we watched, helpless as the prisoners descended further into madness. By the 15th day, only 2 prisoners were left alive. They had ceased all attempts at self-mutilation and were instead focused on something we couldn't understand. They whispered to each other in a language that seemed to be a twisted amalgamation of several tongues. Their eyes, now hollow and black, stared into the cameras as if they could see us on the other side. Desperation clawed at our sanity. We decided to open the chamber against orders. When we entered, the stench of decay and blood overwhelmed us. The prisoners were barely recognizable, their bodies gaunt and covered in wounds. They looked at us with a strange, eerie calm. "We no longer need to be freed," one of them whispered. "We have found peace in the void." Before we could react, one of the soldiers shot both prisoners. It was a mercy kill, I suppose. But the damage was already done. The images of their hollow faces haunt me to this day. We thought it was over. We were wrong. The gas we used had seeped into the walls of the chamber. The facility was shut down, but it was too late. Strange things began happening. People reported hearing whispers in their sleep, seeing shadows move in the corners of their eyes. Some claimed the ghosts of the prisoners haunted the halls. I left the project, unable to cope with the guilt and horror of what we had done. I tried to forget, but the memories festered in my mind like an infection that wouldn't heal. I started having nightmares, vivid and terrifying. I would wake up, drenched in sweat, the whispers from the experiment echoing in my ears. Then the hallucinations began. I saw the prisoners, their mutilated bodies moving through my house, their hollow eyes watching me. They whispered to me, telling me I could never escape. They were always there, lurking in the shadows, waiting. I became a recluse, fearing sleep, fearing the dark. I tried to stay awake, using the same techniques we had used on the prisoners. But it only made things worse. The line between reality and nightmare blurred, and I couldn't tell if I was awake or dreaming. One night, I heard a familiar voice. It was one of the prisoners, the one who had first started screaming. He stood at the foot of my bed, his eyes boring into mine. "You can never escape," he whispered. "We are part of you now." I screamed, but no sound came out. I reached for the lamp, but my hand passed through it. I was trapped in a nightmare, a perpetual state of terror. The experiment had never ended. It had just moved into my mind. I don't know how long I've been like this. Days, months, years? Time has no meaning anymore. The whispers never stop. The shadows never fade. I am one of them now, lost in the void, forever awake, forever haunted. If you're reading this, please, for the love of God, don't repeat our mistake. There are things in the dark that should never be disturbed. Some experiments are not worth the cost. I am a living testament to the horrors that await. Sleep is a precious gift, and to tamper with it is to invite madness. So, if you ever hear whispers in the night, if you see shadows moving where they shouldn't be, remember my story. Remember the sleep experiment, and pray you never find yourself awake in the nightmare we unleashed. April Fool's Day, a day marked by lighthearted pranks and playful tricks, sometimes takes a dark turn. For some, this seemingly innocent day has transformed into a nightmare, forever altering their lives. Here are 3 chilling tales of April Fool's pranks gone horrifyingly wrong, recounted by those who experienced them firsthand. The Babysitter. It was April 1st, 2012. I was 19 and babysitting for the Robinsons, a family that lived a few blocks from my house. They had a 6-year-old daughter, Emily, and an 8-year-old son, Jake. The kids were easy to manage, and the Robinsons always paid well, so I looked forward to these gigs. That night, after the kids were in bed, I settled in the living room with a book. Around 10 p.m., I received a text from Mrs. Robinson. It read, "Emily has been complaining about noises in her closet. Can you check on her?" I found it odd since Emily had gone to bed without a fuss, but I didn't think much of it. I walked upstairs and opened Emily's door quietly. She was sound asleep. I tiptoed to her closet and opened the door, expecting to find a pile of toys or clothes. But the closet was empty. Just as I turned to leave, I heard a whisper, "Help me." I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I quickly closed the closet door and looked at Emily. She was still asleep. I rushed out of the room and texted Mrs. Robinson back, saying everything was fine. She responded immediately, "Gotcha, April Fools." I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding. It was a prank, a stupid prank. I laughed it off and returned to my book, though I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. About half an hour later, I heard a noise from upstairs. It sounded like footsteps. I told myself it was just the house settling, but then I heard it again, louder this time. I decided to check on the kids once more. As I reached the top of the stairs, I noticed Emily's door was ajar. I peeked inside and saw her bed was empty. Panic set in. I rushed to Jake's room. He was also gone. I was about to call the Robinsons when my phone buzzed. It was a picture message. With trembling hands, I opened it. The image showed Emily and Jake tied up and gagged in the basement. The caption read, "Help us." My blood ran cold. This couldn't be a joke anymore. I dialed 911 and explained the situation. The dispatcher stayed on the line with me as I carefully made my way to the basement. The door creaked open and I flicked on the light. There in the corner were Emily and Jake, just as in the picture. I rushed to untie them and they clung to me, sobbing. I could hear the police sirens approaching. As they arrived, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. The police investigated and found signs of forced entry. Whoever had done this was still out there. They never caught the perpetrator, but the Robinsons moved away shortly after, and I stopped babysitting altogether. April Fool's Day lost its charm that night, becoming a reminder of how easily a harmless prank can spiral into a nightmare. The Office Prank. April Fool's Day, 2015. Our office was known for its elaborate pranks, and this year, the bar was set high. We worked in a marketing firm, and our boss, Mr. Thompson, had a reputation for being a good sport. Every year, he'd play along with whatever tricks we had up our sleeves. But this year, someone decided to take it a step too far. I arrived at work to find the office buzzing with excitement. There were fake spiders in the break room, whoopee cushions on chairs, and the classic "kick me" signs taped to unsuspecting backs. It was all in good fun until we got an email from an anonymous sender. The email read, "This year's prank will be unforgettable. Wait until noon." No one knew who sent it, but we were all intrigued. Noon came, and as we gathered in the conference room for a scheduled meeting, the lights suddenly went out. There was a moment of silence, followed by nervous laughter. Then, a message appeared on the projector screen. "There's a bomb in the building. You have 10 minutes to evacuate." Panic erupted. We scrambled for the exits, tripping over each other in our haste. Outside, we huddled together, some of us crying, others frantically calling loved ones. The police arrived within minutes, cordoning off the area and searching the building. It felt like an eternity before they gave the all-clear. As it turned out, there was no bomb. It was a cruel prank, meant to scare us. The police traced the email to one of our own, a disgruntled employee named Mark who had been recently fired. He was arrested, but the damage was done. The sense of safety we once had in our workplace was shattered. Mr. Thompson called us into a meeting the next day. He looked more serious than I'd ever seen him. "April Fool's Day is supposed to be fun," he said, "but what happened yesterday was far from it. We need to remember that our actions have consequences." The office atmosphere changed after that. The prank stopped and a somber mood settled over us. We all learned a harsh lesson that day about the fine line between a joke and a threat. April Fool's Day was never the same. The Haunted House, April Fool's Day, 2018. My friends and I decided to visit an abandoned house on the outskirts of town. It was a local legend, said to be haunted by the ghost of a woman who died there decades ago. We thought it would be fun to scare ourselves a bit, maybe pull a few pranks on each other. We had no idea what we were in for. We arrived at the house just as the sun was setting. It looked like something out of a horror movie. Broken windows, overgrown weeds, and an eerie silence that hung in the air. Armed with flashlights and a sense of bravado, we ventured inside. The interior was just as creepy as the exterior. Dust-covered furniture, peeling wallpaper, and the faint smell of mildew filled the air. We split up to explore, calling out to each other and making spooky noises. It was all in good fun until we heard a scream. We rushed to find our friend Lisa, who was standing in the attic, pale and shaking. She pointed to a corner where we saw a figure, a woman in a tattered dress, her eyes hollow and dark. She moved towards us with an unnatural gait, and we bolted down the stairs, our hearts racing. We regrouped outside, trying to rationalize what we had seen. Was it a prank? Had someone else come to the house to scare us? But Lisa insisted that what she saw was real. Her fear was palpable, and it made us all uneasy. We decided to leave, but as we walked back to our cars, we heard footsteps behind us. We turned around to see the same figure standing at the edge of the property, watching us. We didn't stick around to find out more. We jumped into our cars and sped away, The image of that ghostly woman burned into our minds. Over the next few days, strange things started happening. Objects in our homes would move on their own. We heard whispers in the night, and we all had the same recurring nightmare of the woman in the house. It felt like she had followed us. We did some research and discovered that the house had indeed been the site of a gruesome murder. The woman, named Margaret, had been killed by her husband, who then took his own life. Ever since, people claimed to have seen her ghost, seeking vengeance. We decided to go back one last time, hoping to find some closure. We brought flowers and candles, intending to make peace with Margaret's spirit. As we laid the flowers in the attic, we felt a sudden chill, and the candles flickered out. But then, we heard a whisper, "Thank you." We left the house, feeling a strange sense of relief. The nightmares stopped, and the strange occurrences ceased. We never spoke of that night again, but every April Fool's Day, we remember the haunting experience that turned a simple prank into a terrifying ordeal. April Fool's Day is meant to be a day of laughter and harmless fun, but these stories remind us that not all pranks end well. The line between humor and horror is thin, and when crossed, the consequences can be devastating. These tales serve as a stark warning to think twice before planning your next April Fool's prank, for what starts as a joke can quickly become a nightmare.